And we're back. I'm not sure when I'm actually going to manage to get this one edited and uploaded, but I'm actually recording this episode only a few days after the last one, just because I really want to get these person markers done while I'm still in the right frame of mind. I spent all day yesterday thinking about this, and I thought I might as well get it on video because I'd prefer to record as much of my thought process as possible. So let's just go ahead and give a quick shout out to the patrons and dive right in. So right now we have plenty of forms that go well with these auxiliaries, but I think the priority at this point is to find forms that work well with the case system as well, because we still need to settle on forms for the singular for the human and animate. And also, in retrospect, I think I might have done this bit a bit too hastily, because even though I do like all of these forms, it occurred to me that, especially these genitive forms, which are going to be the ones that are used a lot, they're disyllabic and they're stressed on the penult, which makes them kind of heavy, and I prefer if they were a little bit less obtrusive, I guess. And I realized that as long as the consonant is this T, or indeed any voiceless obstruent, there will always be two syllables because of the epenthesis. And in fact, using a voiced obstruent or a resonant doesn't really help much. So unless we just wanted to say that the R just gets skipped over with frequent use, which is a possibility, I think I'm going to look into using another consonant. And the one I was thinking of is the palatal stop. And in fact, if we are using the palatal stop, then we might as well make that vowel an oo as well, because the palatal fronts the oo to an u, which means the uvula lowers the oo to an o before disappearing, and then the final u raises the o to an and the palatal stop turns into a y, so that would just end up as an In the accusative, the palatal stop would turn into an s when bordering the n, and then it would turn into an r because it's between two voice segments. In the dative, the palatal stop and the r would cluster when the vowel disappears, and then the final u would front the o to an again, and then later epenthesis would break up that cluster again. And I don't mind disyllabic case endings in the accusative and dative because they're not really being used all that often. But for the genitive, the S and the palatal stop will cluster, and then the palatal stop will turn into an S, thereby creating a geminate S. But then we have word final vowel loss, and I'd imagine in most cases the presence of that geminate would stop the final vowel from being lost, but since this form is used so often, I can see that geminate being reduced over time to a single S, and then the final vowel just disappearing as well. So we just get a nice simple us ending. And then we need to make sure that the plural animate is as similar as possible. Accu wouldn't work because the A would be lost pretty quickly, and that would lead to a bunch of other changes depending on the phonology of the stem. We don't want that. Here it's protected by the uvular stop, which just disappears in all instances. So if we put another sort of protective consonant at the beginning of that, the fricative would disappear, the palatal stop would turn into a Y and front the oo, and then the resultant E would front the R to an E, which would then centralize to So we'd end up with I. Now the central vowel and the front rounded vowel are effectively the same, because vowel harmony applies. Not sure about that final Y, though. We could just say that just gets lost. In fact, this form is too similar. Let's make it a bit different. The palatal lateral goes to Y whenever it's not clustered. And it won't cluster with the voiced pharyngeal because that disappears before clustering can happen. And we'll just change the ending to an I, because the I palatalizes the lateral anyway, so that kind of makes sense. but we'd still end up with the same thing. We could either, like I said, just say that the Y gets dropped, or we could say that that first vowel is actually a rounded vowel. So then the rounding would combine with the Y to produce a front rounded vowel. And we need it to be a low vowel, otherwise vowel harmony won't work, because rounding harmony only happens in low vowels. Or we could make the second vowel rounded, which would also turn it into an I think I'm just going to stick with that. It feels a bit contrived to have the initial syllables be so similar, but I mean, we've got all these fancy consonants, we might as well use them. Well, let's just stick with that for the time being. Vowels aren't lost between obstruents and resonants until after H has already disappeared into vocalically. And this is just a regular normal H. So all the vowels would just collapse into each other, the pharyngeal fricative would result in lowering, so you'd get un. I imagine that since that I is coming straight after the palatal lateral, it'll get swallowed up pretty quickly. And then with the vowel lowering and the palatal turning into a Y, and final vowel loss, we would just get us. The problem is, that is now identical to the basic form of the inanimate. And that's not what we want. We want it to be identical to the singulative form of the inanimate. These palatal consonants are now actually leaving too little of a trace. We need them to stand out a bit more now. What if we tried a palatal S? Because that one doesn't turn into a Y, that one just stays as an S. Or it goes to R between vowels. Wow, that actually wouldn't change anything except adding an S in the nominative. Well, it's better than nothing. So what if here then, what if we did basically the same thing? We'll make it sa just for the sake of variety. Ooh, what to do about this one? That one's really clunky. If we say that when the dative gets suffixed, one of the vowels just gets lopped off, then vowel loss between the S and the R. Okay, yeah, that's actually not that bad. I thought that was going to be a lot worse than it actually was, just looking at the phonological form. Now again, with this one, by rules as written, we should end up with a geminate S. But I can absolutely see, with frequent usage, that geminate dropping to a regular S, which would therefore allow word final vowel loss to kick in. Now in that case, our inanimate singular and the plural animate are now identical in the nominative and the genitive, which is exactly what I was looking for. But at the same time, they are also identical in the nominative and the genitive. The nominative and the genitive for both of them are the same. This one and this one are the same. You know what I mean. And I don't think that's a problem because, again, syncretism, always common in these sorts of declensions, and it just means that you need to rely more on the auxiliary and the word order to help you out. No big deal. In fact, I just realized we don't even need that rounded vowel there. We can just have it be a rasa, because the vowel harmony will take care of the rounding for us. So that makes them a little bit more distinct. We could actually fiddle around with the vowels a bit more, but I think I want to test them out as person markers for verbal auxiliaries first. We've already got the ru form here, so let's try rasa and see what happens. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward and not that bad. The only problem is that it's pretty much identical to this form in this case and this case. But we can change that by switching the vowel. Actually, wait. No, we can't. Because even if we do swap out the vowel, it'll get lowered by the pharyngeal. And since it's a low vowel, it will be made identical to the vowel in the auxiliary by vowel harmony, so it would always end up as an A. But it needs to be a low vowel in order for this to work. I mean, we could technically violate our harmony rules. Like if that was an I, then we could say that before vowel harmony properly kicked in this particular form, the I fronted the A. I wouldn't feel good about it, but we could do that. But even then, in this form, the long R is stressed, and there's just so much emphasis on it. It just really feels like the harmony would spread regressively and just turn it into an R. And the same with this form here. So changing the vowel would only affect the forms that we don't need it to affect. Great. Well, there's no way I'm getting rid of this form because that Arhan is too good. I am sold on that by this point. I mean, even if we do manage to change the vowel, these forms are still gonna sound really similar to each other. As long as we've got that S, it's always gonna turn into an R. I honestly don't see any way around that other than changing the consonant, which I don't want to do because that works so nicely for our chart here, or just using suppletion. And even if they are very similar, and in fact share the same forms in some contexts, that's still not the end of the world, because we are in fact trying to sort of collapse the old gender system. So if we say that this is, for example, the human plural, if that turned out to sound the same as the animate plural in some forms, that doesn't really affect anything. It just sort of means that the gender distinction has been lost. I'm fine with that. Yeah, okay, so we'll stick with that for the time being. And speaking of losing gender distinctions, now we have to figure out what we're going to do about the human and animate singular. Because ideally they would both be completely lost. It might be alright if they leave a little bit of a remnant, but as long as they were still identical. Because we wanted the inanimate singular and the animate plural to be identical, so that they both look like a modification on the same stem. So we've already determined that what is effectively the inverse number marker is this underspecified low vowel followed by an S. And in fact, the basic form of the inanimate, which was originally used both for singular and plural, but then in the singular it got replaced by the singulative, that will just get reduced to a single vowel, and even then I imagine that will be lost most of the time. Or it might alter the vowel that comes before it in some strange way. So that kind of already sets a precedent for what we want to have happen with the animate and human plural, where it leaves behind either just a single vowel or nothing. So the easiest way to do it would just be to have the marker just be a single vowel. That already does most of the job for us. Which means that in the nominative, it would either combine with the vowel that came before it or just be dropped. In the accusative, we might have a few geminates. When the I drops between voiceless obstruents, the vowels will combine in the dative into ur, and then in the genitive, a bunch of stuff could happen depending on the phonology of the stem, whether it's infixation and or rhoticization or what have you. Just out of curiosity, what happens when we have a long I? In the nominative, that would just be a normal I, which I could see getting reduced even further and again just being lopped off. The long in the accusative with no geminate. I think the long I would take over the syllable in the dative. So we'd get ir, and we'd just get is in the genitive. I mean, those both work, but if we try out just an e as an auxiliary, I don't think it's going to end well. That's the second time we've ended up with yai, which is awful, and I'm just going to have to bank on suppletion to fix that. Okay, that's not as bad as I thought it would be. Still not good, but not bad. Okay, what about ooh? Will that be any better? Here's another instance where it would just collapse into a single vowel. And with this one we end up with Y again, just like we did up here. And to be honest, I am tempted to turn that W into a V. Because for whatever reason, I think Vi sounds a lot nicer than Y. I think I'm just going to change that rule a bit. Those are pretty good, actually. I quite like the alternation between Vi and for example. So if we made the human singular an oo, then if the stem ended in an obstruent, or at least a voiceless one, then we would still get the geminate. But if it didn't, then the H would disappear, and the U and I would combine. I wonder if those two would merge over time, just by analogy. That would be ideal, but I don't know if that makes sense. And it's the same in the dative. They are the same, and the only difference is the vowel height. Is it too much of a cop-out to make this vowel low as well? I guess as long as they're identical in the nominative singular, that should be fine. But even more important is having it be identical with the animate singular. If we were going to take advantage of vowel harmony to make the human singular and the animate singular identical, then the animate singular would need to have a rounded high vowel, because E is neutral. So we'd need to have either oo or ü. We've already used oo a lot here, which I'm not happy about. In fact, we can change the singulative ending to xia to make it a little bit different, and that wouldn't have any effect, except it would make this go to unra, which I still like. But now that looks a little bit too similar to this. We change that to an I, which will change that to a palatal fricative, which still looks pretty similar to that, but it's good enough. If we did something like uki, the palatal stop disappears to give us that front rounded vowel, and the accusative, the vowel disappears between the palatal stop and the H, which geminates the palatal stop. So would that count as a cluster of two palatal stops? And therefore it would go to a geminate S? Or would it just count as a single long consonant and therefore turn into a Y? I'm thinking just because of phonological reduction, it'll ultimately end up as a Y. Once again, I think we can justify the I disappearing following the palatal, and I could see that potentially reducing further to just ur. And then again, for this form, we could either justify having a geminate S, or we could say that further reduction reduces the geminate, and we just get a normal us ending. Actually, no we don't, because we don't have u in this language. Just pretend every time I've written u here, it's actually The only potential problem that I'm seeing is that these forms for the dative and genitive are pretty similar to the plural forms. Again, syncretism isn't necessarily bad. Let me just try out uki down here. Another case where the two palatal stops cluster, and I'm not sure whether to count that as two consonants or one. If we count it as a Y like we did before, it just reduces down to an E again. Just realized I did that one wrong. Again, not terrible. So I think one way or another, we can justify the inanimate, human, and animate singular as being more or less identical, which is to say, non-existent. But are they similar enough in the other forms? If we made that a long oo, that would remove the possibility of gemination. It would just give us a long oo, just like the animate singular. And also, with this form, the urra, with the geminate r, we could say as part of the phonological reduction, when the geminate is lost, it lengthens the preceding vowel, so we could still theoretically end up with ur as well. And we could do potentially the same thing for the genitive as well, make that a long u. So that would make them identical. I will have to leave that decision for another time. For now, I just want to settle on these forms for the auxiliaries. I think that's all the fine-tuning I need to do in order to make inverse number work. In which case, we now have more than enough forms to decide our final person markers. In fact, we have one too many. I think I'm going to ditch the ku, just because it's comparatively boring. And there we go. 10 person markers for our 10 different persons. Right, so I was originally going to end it there, but in the few days that it's been since I recorded the last bit, I have not been able to stop thinking about these person markers, and For whatever reason, I just really want to get them done and dusted now. And like I said, I'd like to get as much of my thought process recorded as possible. And I've got some extra time today, so I thought I might as well see if I can actually get these things done. So first off, like I think I said last time, I'm not a fan of how often the oo vowel is used in these forms. I think we need a bit more variation there, so I might change up these ones. I'm also not a fan of how many of them start either with a vowel or with a consonant that I know is going to be lost anyway. That feels kind of contrived, and I don't think we need to resort to that necessarily. Because with phonological reduction, a lot of the time, even quite strong or hard consonants can just get lost. Like, off the top of my head, in the transition from Latin to Spanish, the second person plural ending, let's just say in the present tense, in Latin it's an artis, like you plural love would be amatis, whereas in Spanish it's just amais. That T has just been completely skipped over. So I'd like at least one of these vowel initial forms to begin with some harder or stronger consonant, which can then just get skipped over. The difficulty is we also have to make sure that that consonant sounds good as an auxiliary. Because more than likely, when that sound, whatever it is word initial, like it will be in the auxiliaries, it won't get skipped over. You're probably sick of this by now, and I'm almost certain I've already tested this at some stage, but just to refresh my memory, what happens if the auxiliary is just R? Just a plain old R vowel. Okay, if we take that as a sort of base, because that's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. What consonant could go at the beginning of that would sound nice? You know, actually, I've been thinking about this as well. I do really quite like vi. I like having that initial V. But in this case, it only shows up in that one form. So I was trying to think of some way to engineer things to give us a more consistent word initial V, and it struck me that one really, really easy way to do it is to just say that we had w in the proto-lang, and we might as well throw in y as well. Not only does that just make sense, because they are very common sounds, but it wouldn't actually affect any of our sound changes, because we get both y and w pretty early on anyway, and then they combine to form various diphthongs and the front-rounded vowels. So all adding them to the proto-lang is going to do is just give us more of those, which is always good. So if we stick with that, and if we made it wa, now we have some nice, consistent initial V's. That was easy, and I quite like all of those. And if we try that up here, all that W is going to do is just combine into a diphthong or result in a front-rounded vowel, depending, of course, on what vowel comes before it. So for the modern form, all we can really say is that it will end in a vowel of some sort. And for the accusative, I was a bit reticent last time about having the A and the I border each other and turning into an I diphthong, but I think it's perfectly justifiable to say that that diphthong would monophthongize over time, either turning into a long A, or, potentially, I could also see it turning into an E, and if it did that, then it would combine with the W, and it would just become which would be ideal. Same thing with the dative, the A and the oo could combine into a diphthong, which would then turn into a monophthong, more than likely a long O, and the W would probably just assimilate, and the genitive would stay pretty similar, and what happened to the W, again, would just sort of depend on the preceding vowel. Now that is in line with some of the other forms that we've made so far, which is a good thing. So let's go ahead and say that that is the human singular, which means we need to change the animate singular to look exactly like it. And in order to do that, we need to change the vowel, because we can't be having any high vowels. I just realized, does the singulative here, the xia, does that actually need to be palatalized? because we're already using the palatal down here, partly because it's followed by an E. Now let's just say it's sa. We've already used back consonants to create low vowels up here. I wouldn't want to pull the same trick twice, so this one will probably also just have to be based on an R. You know, now that I think about it, it's probably not necessary to use the back consonants to lower the following high vowel in both of these cases. It does feel a bit forced. It would still need to be a low vowel, so it would still need to use R. If we say then that this one is ga, with just a plain old G, that G is lost intervocalically very early on. It first becomes the voiced velar fricative and then it just disappears. So that will really quickly just get reduced down to a single vowel, which will then just get lopped off, which is perfect. But it only becomes the voiced velar fricative intervocalically, and everywhere else it becomes the voiced velar stop, which later on goes to a z, which then roticizes to r, which means whereas here it would just be a single vowel or nothing, when it's an auxiliary and that G comes word initially, we get word initial R. That's great. I really like that alternation. And plus, Rai sounds pretty good. On the other hand, those two suppletive forms are pretty terrible. One rather specific phonological thing that I don't like, personally, is when two syllables that both begin with R come next to each other. Not just in this language, but just in any language. So something like rara, terrible. But the good thing is, those are our suppletive forms, and so we don't have to use them for this. I actually like those ones quite a bit. It's looking quite Japanese here with wa and ga, but that's all well and good. And yes, even if we did that, our inverse marking system would still be intact, because the inanimate plus the singulative and the plural animate would still be effectively identical, at least in the nominative and genitive. So the only one left then is this animate singular. And now I see that we may have gotten rid of the oo, but now there are way too many R vowels. Okay, maybe instead, what if the inanimate singular and the plural animate were the ones that were associated with high vowels? That wouldn't be too difficult to change, I think. Because that wouldn't change anything except the vowel, except for the fact that the G would palatalize before the I. So it would become a palatal stop, which would then become Z, which would then become R, which we don't want. I've actually just seen that it says when not clustered, but I'm going to change that. Intervocalically and word finally. It's a bit specific, but that still kind of makes sense. So if it goes to a y intervocalically, we don't really have anything to worry about, because that will just assimilate into the following E. The problem happens when there's a sonorant that comes before the G, because then vowel loss would happen, and then when it's next to the sonorant, it'll eventually turn into an R. Which, actually, now that I think about that, that's actually kind of cool. It fits the phonesthetic, and it gives us a really easy class of irregulars. Either that, or we could just say that the stop is just lost before it gets to that point. If, like I said, because of phonological reduction, it just gets skipped over. So, okay, sure, that works. But does it work as an auxiliary? Wow, yeah, it really does. Not a huge fan of ri. I mean, it's serviceable, it's not terrible. But we've got rai again, which I really like. I think in this case we can justify the pharyngeal fricative disappearing, and then since the I is stressed, it'll take over the syllable and turn into a long I, so we get rin, which is nice. And then here, if we wanted to, we could just get rid of both pharyngeal fricatives and end up with ran. Once again, the suppletive forms are trash, but we don't need to worry about those. So then if we stick with that, now we just have to change the plural animate so it also results in a high vowel. I know I'm kind of wandering all over the place phonologically here, but I really want to find something that works. I promise I won't be this picky about the phonology of every single word in the language. It's just these auxiliaries that I really want to make sure sound good. So this one then will need to keep its high vowel. So right off the bat, get rid of that pharyngeal. What if, for the sake of argument, it was a plain old T? Now actually, that is useful to point out, is that because this is a disyllabic suffix, and both syllables are short and closed, that means that the stress will always come on the syllable just before it, which means that vowel loss won't happen between the T and whatever consonant serves as the onset of the syllable that comes before it. Which is really good, because that means it's more likely to be skipped over and not join with the previous syllable, and become some sort of phonological remnant. Yes, perfect. That gives us exactly what we're looking for. And then as an auxiliary, it's okay. I don't really like tissa very much. Maybe we can justify having that geminate S shorten and then turn into an R, and maybe with vowel loss as well. We can get something workable out of it. Either that, or once again, we can just resort to suppletion. And the other ones are okay. Not everything can be perfect. Just realized I did that wrong as well. The vowel loss would happen between the R and the S first, to use ura, which means they would be almost identical in the dative, as well as the genitive and the nominative. So that actually works even better than I thought it would. Because if this suffix came after a stem that ended in an U, then the U and the E would merge into an U. And I could very easily see, if that was the case, these two suffixes, even though there is a slight phonological difference, being reanalyzed to be the same thing. So now, once again, the only thing left is the animate singular, which needs to be a low vowel, but now I am troubled by the lack of the U vowel. So let's make that an U, which we would then need to lower, which is fine because we no longer have any back consonants used in any of these, so we can afford to use one down here. So pretty much invariably, we would need something like this old glue auxiliary. Oh, wait a second. I remember here I was struggling to decide whether I wanted to keep the U or not. But if we did, it would turn into a W, and as we've already decided, W fortifies to V word initially, which means that form would be identical to this wa form that we've already settled on. And that is actually a good thing, because that reinforces this merger we want between the human singular and the animate singular. Ideally, we'd have those two just collapse into each other completely, just like we did for these two. I also just realized that in this one, the stress is actually on the U, which means that if we do decide to lose the geminate pharyngeal, then it would be the U that would take over the syllable. So we could have un, but then the U would turn into an so we'd get ern, which is okay. Or we could say that the word initial U shortens up to a W, which then becomes a V. Either way, that could work. And same here, actually. The stress is on the U. So we could have that one become ern, and that one become van. And if we don't like either of those, we've got these two suppletive forms, which are both pretty decent. Okay, I'm sold. Let's go with glue, then. Yeah, so with the exception of the rounding in the genitive, which will be taken care of by vowel harmony anyway, they are identical. I think we finally got something that actually works. So that means we now have our 10 chosen person markers. Right, so now I'm going to go through each and every one of these and make sure to the best of my current ability that they are all valid and correct. I know this video is probably running quite long at this point, but screw it, I'm on a roll. You know, actually, right off the bat, I think I'm going to change this K to a Q, just because I like the sound slightly better, and I'd like the uvula to be quite prominent if possible. This does bring up the question of whether or not we want to ditch that geminate, or roticize it, or do any number of other things to it. I'll come back to that. See, I think I had originally highlighted these 6 because I didn't like the fact that they were essentially the same except for a stress shift. But at least for this one, it occurs to me that it wouldn't be arai, it would be aras. Because the vowel loss, that should be a palatal stop, because the vowel loss between the R and the palatal stop will happen to produce a word final cluster after word final vowel loss, and then epenthesis breaks it up. So actually that's fine. We do still have that problem with nidai and nidai. I don't really like nidai too much. Nidai is quite nice, but not nidai. I'm thinking that maybe that D gets skipped over, which I can see happening, fair enough. So it would go from like nidai to nidai to nidai to niai, and it would just sort of get dropped. And then niai, I can see just reducing to nai. I like nai, that's good. And I think while I'm at it, I might actually do the same thing for these ones, because we've got the same problem here with savai and savai. Once again, I can just see that B being gradually skipped over, and psi is also pretty good. Whereas for these forms, I can imagine that they would retain the voiced stop because it's the onset of the stressed syllable. So nidan to nidan, it makes sense to me that you'd be more likely to retain that voiced stop when it was in that stressed position. I don't know if that actually makes any sense, but I'm going to go with it. And we have exactly the same problem over here as well, which we can fix by reducing that to nan and san, which are both pretty decent. And as I've already said, both nidan and savan are both really, really great. So I'm definitely keeping those. For this one, I think I'm going to keep it as a long vowel, at least for now. Oh wait, no, it wouldn't be earn, because the oo drops to an o before that point. It would be orn, which I'm not a big fan of, but we'll stick with it for now. To me, this one just feels like it would just become ohan. That just feels right. I'm not particularly pleased with it, but we'll go with that. Again, I have yet to decide what to do about that geminate. As it is, I don't really like it. Now here, theoretically, we could knock out that geminate and just make it purely a distinction between a long and a short vowel. So van versus van. Because over here we've already got a distinction between vai and vai. I did that down here to turn this one into ran. In that case, I might as well turn this one into a short I as well. I just realized the stress is on the I in this one as well. So actually, yeah, if we're following the pattern, that one would have a long I. Well, vowel length is evidently very important in this language. And actually with this one too, the stress is going to be on the second A. So it wouldn't be aran, it would just be arhan again. Which, as much as I like it, I'm not sure we can justify it covering both forms. The problem is, if I roticize that S, then it's going to be too transparently related to that form. So I'm going to keep them as geminates. So I've highlighted the forms that I like and don't like. Most of them I think are pretty solid, and now it's time to get rid of some of these bad forms, along with some of the forms that are just kind of monotonous or repetitive, using suppletion. So these are the two basic suppletive forms that we were already thinking about. And we're definitely not going to use both of them because they're identical except for whether or not the S is palatal. On the whole, I'm tempted to use the palatal one just because that encourages more front-rounded vowels. I don't like how so many of them end in the same on ending. Again, it's too bad that this isn't a refugium language, because if it was, it would fit so perfectly. And it's the same with these forms, how they basically all end in I. In fact, they literally all end in I. So I'm thinking that this auxiliary will be suppletive in certain forms of either this auxiliary or this auxiliary. Now, as I have stated multiple times, I really like Nidan and Sivan. I definitely want to keep those. Whereas Nidai and Savai, I really want to get rid of, because they sound too similar, but not as good. However, the equivalent forms that we have for this auxiliary are both terrible, and I'd much rather have Nidai and Savai over them any day of the week. So that means we can't use this form for this one. It has to be for this one. And if that's the case, then first up, let's move that one over, Tuskle, because I like that one. It's got that nice SQ cluster that I've been looking for. We'll have it replace Takan. And I like Uru much better than Ohan. And by the way, this auxiliary will be suppletive for a particular person, or either singular or plural. But we'll figure out which it is after we decide which forms we're exchanging. And that will only be suppletive specifically for this auxiliary. We definitely don't want to use Klassu, because that's already too much like Klassa. And the same with Tumru, which is too much like Tumra. Now this double Arhan that we've got, one of them's got to go. But for this auxiliary, the only thing we have to replace it with is Eru, which is so much less good. There's a limit to how much suppletion we can actually afford to employ. Because if we're using suppletion for these forms, and I also want to use suppletion for these forms, I can't also have suppletion for these forms. That's just too much. So it looks like, as much as it pains me, I think we're going to go with Eru. And then Tiran, Van, and Reen are all better than any of their suppletive equivalents, so we'll keep all of those. So that's one auxiliary done and dusted. And even though there are these forms that I've highlighted as not liking very much, I think it's far more important to address the monotony of all of these final I's. So I think we're going to use suppletion for this form as well. But the question is, what will the suppletive form be? I remember I said at one point that I wanted to try a rounded low vowel as an auxiliary, just to give us a bit more rounding in some of these forms. So what if we tried ru, which would rapidly become ro as the pharyngeal pulled the vowel down? Nah, this isn't really working, because the priority is to find ones to replace these two, and that's just not going to cut it. In fact, for these forms, using a low rounded vowel wouldn't actually affect anything, because they've both got high vowels in the auxiliary, which are immune to rounding harmony. Okay, well, so much for that idea. Okay, if we had something like ra, and if we again said that those voiced stops could be dropped, then that could either become nir or nar. I think I'm going to go with nir, because that's just where the stress is. It just feels more intuitive. And for this one, it would be sur, which would turn into sur. If we make that ri, then we can justify that I fronting the u. So instead of sur, we get sur, which I like better. So let's apply that to the other forms and see what we get. Okay, so we got a couple of pretty decent ones out of that. I do quite like var, even though it would be replacing vai, which I do really like. But we already have vai up here as well, and we have vai with a short a down here, so yeah, not an issue. In fact, I might even sneak uri in there as well. None of the other ones are really working for me, so I'm tempted to go ahead and say that this is what our final forms will look like. I'm pretty happy with most of those. There's a couple of duds in there, but it's unreasonable to expect everything to be perfect. And I will doubtlessly change my mind on some of these and notice several mistakes as I edit this, which will be addressed next time. But for now, I think this video has gone on way, way too long. So that is where we shall end it for now. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope that was at least somewhat tolerable to endure, and I will see you next time.